And so we breathe in peace once more. And exhale love. Checking out the microphone. And here we are. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about what it means to take refuge in yourself and some ways in which we can go about doing that. But first, I want to start this off by reading an excerpt from At Home in the World, Thich Nhat Hanh, page 90, called Hermitage in the Wind. And for anyone who may not know what a hermitage is, imagine if you went to a retreat or a monastery and you just stayed in this little room by yourself. So it's kind of like a solo retreat that's filled with a lot of silence. So hermit, hermitage, village, hermit, hermitage. I don't know. But you're just putting those two words together where it's some place to stay as a bit of a hermit, though you probably are part of an expanded community, though there's definitely more of an introspective time there than if you went on a other form of retreat where you might be staying, sharing everything together. So that's just a little bit of that word. Hermitage in the Wind. About 30 years ago, I was enjoying a solo forest retreat in the Hermitage at our sweet potato community in northern France. I liked sitting and walking in the woods. One very beautiful morning, I decided to spend the whole day in the woods, so I brought along a bowl of rice, some sesame seeds, and a bottle of water. Off I went. I planned to stay out the whole day, but around 3 in the afternoon, black clouds began to gather in the sky. Before leaving the hermitage that morning, I had opened the door and all the windows so the sunshine and fresh air could come in. But soon the wind began to blow hard, and I knew I had to go back and take care of the hermitage. On arriving home, I found it in a terrible state of disarray. Strong gusts of wind had strewn the papers from my desk all over the place. It felt miserable and cold and dark. The very first thing I did was to close the door and all the windows so the wind couldn't continue to wreak havoc. Then I made a fire in the fireplace, and as the fire started to come alive, I began to collect all the sheets of paper from the floor, gather them on the table, place a little brick on top, and try to make the hermitage tidy and in order. Soon the fire had made everything warm, pleasant, and cozy. I sat down by the fire, toasted my fingers, and enjoyed listening to the wind and the rain outside. There are days when you feel like it's just not your day, and that everything is going wrong. The more you try, the worse the situation becomes. Everyone has days like this. That's when it's time to stop everything, go home, and take refuge in yourself. The first thing to do is close the doors and the windows. The eyes, the ears, the nose, the tongue, the body, and the mind are the 6 windows you close when everything feels like a mess. Our 6 senses are windows to the mind. Close everything in order to prevent the strong wind from blowing in and making you miserable. Shut the windows, shut the door, and make a fire. Create a feeling of warmth, coziness, and comfort by practicing mindful breathing. Rearrange everything, your feelings, your perceptions, your emotions. They're all scattered everywhere. It's a mess inside. Recognize and embrace each emotion. Collect them the way I collected all the sheets of paper that were scattered all over the hermitage. Practice mindfulness and concentration and tidy up everything within yourself. This will help you restore your peace and your calm. If we only rely on external conditions, we will get lost. We need a refuge we can rely on, and that is the island of the self. Firmly established on our inner island, we're very safe. We can take time to recover and restore ourselves and become stronger until we're ready to go out and again to engage the world. Deep breath. So, for those of you who have our handout, I have the first 3 lines here is taking refuge within self, aka your true home. The second one is closing off the 6 senses, the windows and the door to the world, and stoking your inner hearth, your ability to cultivate warmth and comfort within. And a hearth, for those of you who may not know what that word is, back in the day, that's the place in front of the fireplace where a lot of people would gather and cook meals. And so when you ever hear the saying, it's the hearth of the home, it's the heart of the home. And so we all also have that inner hearth within ourselves, which I also call the heart. So let's talk about that, taking refuge within the self. Who, when you're feeling not great, often reaches for external stimuli to distract yourself? That's most of humanity right now, because that's often what we're taught, by the previous generation, and then we adopt it and we teach it to our children. It's interesting that the way that we unwind and the way that we veg out, the way that we take the edge off might be with a substance, might be with stimulating our mind with additional like television or social media, or we go talk to someone right away. There's always something that we're grasping for to take the edge off. And so we're conditioned, maybe unknowingly, but we're conditioned to always be grasping rather than returning inward. And so that's the first lesson of today. When you notice that you're in your grasping nature, the grasping mind of ego, redirect that focus and take a moment to return inward. But what does that entail? And I loved how Thich Nhat Hanh talked about the six senses. And so we have our eyes, right? So the eyes are a great way in which we're constantly receiving information. So it's really important when we're in that time that we're trying to come inward to be very mindful of what your eyes are resting upon. And so that might be turning off social media for a bit, turning off the television, and turning off anything. If maybe there's a room in your house that's very messy, maybe you don't want to rest in there for that time being, because once your eyes lays upon the mess, you're going to start analyzing it or judging it or wanting to go to work on it or get turned off by it. And so find a neutral place where your eyes can rest, or possibly just close them for a time being. But then we have the ears, right? Who constantly listens to stuff? Maybe you have the TV on in the background or a radio on, or just there's always some kind of chatter happening around you. And that's another way we're constantly receiving stimulation, even if we're not intently or intentionally listening to it. If it's in the background, there's something going on. I always tell folks, if you're someone that always falls to sleep listening to the radio or something, or listening to some channel, I invite you to try doing that without it for a whole week. Turn on a fan for white noise if you need some type of thing, because your subconscious is still working and it may actually keep you from getting the full amount of sleep. Now, if you're intentionally trying to learn stuff, great. People say, listen to like an audiobook in another language, while you're trying to rest that night. But again, what are you trying to do? Are you actively wanting to rest? Or are you actually trying to still stimulate your mind and learn something? So again, very important. What stimulation is going into the ears and the eyes? And then we have the tongue. This is where you see a lot of, especially Zen masters, they love their tea. And so tea is a very healthy, well, depending on how you make it, it's a very healthy sensation that you're able to enjoy that can bring you into the present moment. And so you're activating the tongue, or possibly if you're just not doing anything, you neutralize it. And then you have the nose. And so have you ever walked into a home or your home that felt a bit musty or stagnant because you just really haven't tended to it lately? Or maybe you're someone that always keeps on top of it and you walk in, there's always a freshness. So really, whenever you think of the sense of smell, think of a stagnancy or a freshness. And I'm a big fan of not so much creating the freshness through chemicals, because again, that's doing something else to the body when you're breathing it in. And so instead, you can find non-chemical based incense to actually bring a freshness into the room. You can clean it, make sure it's all tidy, but at the same time, if you want to bring in some natural scents, you're able to do that as well. Or of course, flowers, herbs, all types of stuff like that. And then of course, we have our mind and our body. And so sometimes with the mind and body, it's just being able to return to a place of stillness. Because many people actually, when they find themselves wanting to be in distraction, they're constantly stimulating their body. Who's the type that who's someone that doesn't really sit still that often? There's a lot of individuals out there that struggle with that. And it's not necessarily bad or wrong, but it's being able to just notice that returning to your body rather than constantly keeping it moving at all times. Because have you ever seen a running stream before where it just go, 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 go? It's very difficult to see a reflection in moving water. So when you learn to be able to return to your body and keep it still for a time being, it helps. But then the last one, the hardest one, is the mind, right? Because even if you close your eyes, your mind's still going to town, isn't it? And that is where all the other senses comes into being. When you start to bring the other senses into alignment, such as the eyes and the ears, and creating a space of peace, what's interesting is your mind is more likely to follow in suit. So let's breathe that in. So I'm going to read this paragraph and we're going to break it down a little more. Relying only on external conditions can perpetuate feelings of overstimulation and disconnect. We may grasp for or indulge in temporary distractions, yet these stimuli never address the core need of returning home and tending to one's own hearth. Momentarily closing off the six senses through intentional breathing and mindfulness allows for realigning of perception. Tidying up the headspace and heart space reignites mind-body balance, allowing for peace and clarity to return. Deep breath. And so back when I lived, the first place I ever lived by myself, it was just a small cottage, maybe like 400 or 500 square feet. In one of the rooms, I just had a blank wall, kind of like this. And then I had, it's actually not here. See that little table over there resting upon our air conditioning unit? That was my altar. And so I had a Buddha on it, and throughout the season, depending on the season, I would have different, especially fall, I had gourds and little pumpkins, and I would just always make it seasonal. And I would always have incense and candles, and I would often sit before it every single day at some point. But anytime I walked past it to go to the restroom, I would look over at it, and it always invited a sense of calm. And if you see that giant Buddha picture over there, that was above it. And so that was my little altar space. Then when we moved in together in our first place that we lived, we had a spare bedroom. In that spare bedroom, we kept it completely open. There was nothing in it except the altar. Americans in our culture might see that as a waste of a room. They might see that as it's just an empty room. You know, why aren't you filling it with stuff? Or why, you know, it's almost like a frivolous thing. It's, if there's something that's not being fully utilized with furniture that could be put in it, the mind instantly wants to fill up with space. Have you ever had a blank space in your home or your bedroom and you just wanted to fill it with something? Again, that's overstimulation. It's not bad, it's not wrong, but think about that. If you had a clear room to go into every single day that only had an altar in it, what would that do to your psychology? Really contemplate that for a moment. An empty space to enter into without constant stimulation other than the intentional stimulation of peace. Interesting, isn't it? And most of our homes are also filled with a lot of clutter, most likely. And that's just, you know, it happens naturally. So whether or not our house is constantly full of just things, knickknacks, decorations, furniture, or possibly there's the onset of clutter, very few people actually have a singular room that they can just go to without additional stimulation, without tasks at hand, because maybe in the corner you have a little art station. If you're really cultivating your inner peace there, but then you look in the corner of your eye, you're going to be stimulated by, oh, there's that project I want to work on, or maybe you start to get this other idea in your head. So again, even if it's something joyful in the corner, it's not going to have the same effect. Or maybe in the corner you have your office, and then you work from home a lot. And again, your mind starts to go into that direction. Now, of course, what Thich Nhat Hanh is teaching here when he says return to your home, return to your taking refuge in the self, is the ability to do that at any time, no matter the external conditions. So you could be on a subway in New York and still return to your own inner being and close off your senses. And that is possible. But what I'm inviting you, I'm always about the middle way and how do we get from point A to point B. The middle part is establishing a place in your home, and it doesn't have to be a full room, but I'm just kind of trying to pitch that if you do have a spare room that you could turn into that. But if you don't, you could still have a small altar space like I did in that very small cottage where I did have my computer over here, couch over here, and then, well, I just had one little wall that was empty. So when I looked at the wall, that's all I saw was just the altar space. Yes, there was some stuff around me, but when I faced this way, all it was in front of me. Does that make sense? So whether you can create that for yourself, or whether you do have a spare room that you could turn into an empty space, it's an invitation. And every time you pass by that little altar, every time you pass by that room, you're going to notice that it beckons you, especially if you're having a rough day. You pass by and you see it, and it's so inviting. It's so calm, it's so peaceful, and you're going to notice that just without even trying, your body just starts to walk into it from time to time, and you sit down before it and you take a breath. And sometimes all it takes is just a minute or two. Let's breathe that in. And for parents, especially with little ones, what an invitation that would be. Rather than sending kids to their room, you could invite them and say, because you learn as a family that peace is important. I don't know about you, but when I was brought up, peace was not something that was talked about at the dinner table. It was not something talked about anytime any of us were worked up. It was more about just right or wrong behavior. Who can relate to that? It's just about right or wrong behavior versus having an ongoing discussion of peace every day with your children, with your teenagers, with your spouse, with whoever is in your life. And when you have a room designated to that, and the children see that you always go to it every single day, and then eventually they pique their curiosity, and then they might want to join you. They just say, what's going on in here? Well, let me teach you about meditation, Stuart. And it just becomes a beautiful opportunity to where you can teach children to start to self-regulate. And so through teaching self-awareness and that there's a room for peace, they can recognize that when they start to get worked up, that there's a room designated for how to handle difficult emotions. And they'll notice just energetically when they go into the room, they feel better. But when they go into their bedroom, most children's bedrooms are a little chaotic, wouldn't you say? It's filled with their own neurosis. And so when they say, go cool off in your bedroom, not always the most effective approach because there's so much stimulation there. But when you have a room designated for that, it changes the dynamic. I could just see like 100 years from now, all of a sudden, just we all have altar rooms. But wouldn't that be juicy? Wouldn't that be delicious to recognize that peace is important and that it's something that we can actually bring into our home and designate a full space for? Fascinating, isn't it? Fascinating. We have the man cave, or what someone said, the she shed, which sounds really interesting. So we'll call it the lady cave. We have these places for our own whatever activities they may be, and the whole gender thing's not really important, but we have these rooms for vegging out or for recreation or for fun, whatever they may be. But why do we not, and use my language, why don't we fucking have a room for peace? Which didn't sound so peaceful. Why don't we have a room designated for peace? But we have rooms designated for everything else. Is it any wonder why we're all often very neurotic when even in our very homes we don't have a place that we can learn to cultivate the ability to return to ourselves? Because those room for peace, even though it's an external thingamajig, great vocabulary there, even though it's an external thingamajig, it teaches you how to cultivate your inner sanctuary. And then once you gain enough practice in that, you can do it anywhere, even as I said, on a New York subway, which one of my first mentors actually said that. She's like, really, the best thing that you can ever do is be able to meditate when you're constantly surrounded by noise, constantly surrounded by interaction and all that stuff. That is the goal, not just always when you're peace. But I believe to get to that point, it's important to start somewhere. And it definitely is easier when you have a room that invites you into it, or again, even just an altar space. But here's my big thing. Don't just make I invite you not to just make an altar space just on something that's high up here, on like a coffee table that's high above, and that you just walk by it, but you can never actually sit in front of it. See how low that little table is? It's about that high. Find something that invites you and brings you to the earth. Why might that be important? Something to bring you down to the earth. The spirituality we teach, the philosophy is a lot of Buddhism, but the spirituality we teach is often earth-based. That's where Ganesha comes from. It's wanting to always bring us back and connect us down and on to Mother Earth. And so that's going to be something very important to recognize as well. So let's breathe that in. So closing off the six senses, the eyes, the nose, the ears, the tongue, the body, and the mind. And that kind of talks about what we talked about a couple weeks ago about the arts of limitation. Limiting what is coming in for a short amount of time will then allow you to hold space for so much more later on. Let me repeat that. Limiting to what is coming into your mind right now and to your senses will actually have the opposite effect of allowing you to hold space for so much more later on. So you see how we limit a little bit now so that we can have so much more energy later. Rather than push, I just need to keep pushing myself to bring in all the information, bring in all the information, bring in all the information, the stimulation, the stimulation, the stimulation. And when in doubt, sometimes just a short 15, 20-minute nap can absolutely help you as well. If you're not able to do everything I said today, sometimes just taking that time out for just 15 to 20 minutes and shutting down your mind, even if you go into a short slumber, will help reset that button of overstimulation. And anyone who's empathic or an empath, which means you pick up a lot of stuff from other people as well, even if you're not talking to them, you can actually just walk by them and you can feel their own thoughts or their energy. That is a thing that some people have. That was one of my biggest issues as a child because I did not know how to handle that. For empaths in particular, it's really important to be able to go inward rather than constantly having all of our antennas on at all times, receiving every damn signal known to humankind that's coming, and then that's where a lot of panic attacks can happen. By the way, who's ever had a panic attack before? Another word for panic attack is over fucking stimulation. When you have that overstimulation, and then you have your neurosis of the mind that starts to freak out and judge everything and thinks it can't handle it, what the body and mind does is it shuts down and then it reboots. Panic attacks are not a terrible thing, but they come at very inconvenient times. But think of the mind as a computer where it just overheats from overstimulation, too many tabs open, trying to do so many things. The mind happens in the same way, and then the panic attack comes, reboots itself, but we can easily, and I help people with this all the time, we can easily not go to that extremeness when we understand how our mind can only handle so much information at so many times. So always big word to take away from today's sermon: stimulation, overstimulation, limiting, dropping into peace, having an altar room, or at the least setting up your own altar. Let's take a breath. Okay, so I'm going to end today's sermon a little bit shorter because I feel like that is some juicy information. And for anyone listening on YouTube, if you actually end up setting up an altar for yourself, or maybe you already have one, feel free to comment down below and let us know how you do it and maybe how it assisted you, or after you set it up, how it has assisted you. It'd be lovely to hear what you put on your altar and how you go about doing it. Links are down below for anyone who would like to donate either through Patreon or PayPal. Always appreciated, and we'll see you next week.